December 1944. The Ardennes forest stood silent beneath a heavy blanket of snow, white, still, and deceptively peaceful. Beneath that frozen silence, an entire German army was preparing to strike. In the woods near the Belgian town of Bastogne, German soldiers huddled in half-dug foxholes, their breath turning to mist in the bitter air. They had been told the offensive would be swift, a lightning blow that would shatter the exhausted Americans, drive through to Antwerp, and turn the war back in Germany's favor. To many of them, it almost seemed believable. They had surprised the Allies before. They had crushed defenses in France in 1940. They had held out against the Red Army's tides in the east. Now, they would do it again. One last victory before the war's end. And as they marched westward through the snow-covered forests, some laughed at the American soldiers they encountered. The Americans, with their layered coats, wool scarves, and thick gloves, looked like overstuffed scarecrows. "Too soft for the cold," some Germans sneered. "They need half a warehouse of clothing just to stand in the snow." But the laughter didn't last long. When the Ardennes offensive, what the Allies would call the Battle of the Bulge, began on December 16, 1944, the Germans advanced with early success. They struck through the fog, catching American lines by surprise. Tanks of the 5th and 6th Panzer Armies rolled forward under skies thick with snow, and the 101st Airborne Division, resting after months of brutal combat, was rushed to hold the key crossroads town of Bastogne. At first, the weather seemed to favor the Germans. Allied aircraft were grounded by clouds and blizzards. American units were scattered, communications broke down, and supplies ran thin. Bastogne became a frozen island, surrounded by the enemy. But as the days passed, the cold became the real enemy. The temperature plunged below freezing, wind chill cutting through uniforms like blades. American soldiers dug foxholes through the icy soil, their shovels breaking on frozen ground. They layered whatever they could find: gloves from fallen comrades, socks over socks, paper wrapped around their boots to keep frost from biting through. They had no tents, no stoves, no fires, just cold and silence, and the will to hold. Across the lines, German soldiers were beginning to suffer too. The offensive had moved faster than their supply lines could follow. Trucks stalled in the snow. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Many soldiers wore thin autumn coats from the previous campaigns. Greatcoats worn to threads, boots cracked from years of marching. Some units received no winter clothing at all. Their commanders had promised the operation would be over in 2 weeks. They had no plan for a long siege in the snow. Now, the men who had once mocked the Americans' overpreparedness were freezing in their trenches. Frost crept over rifles, metal freezing to skin. Rations turned solid, canteens cracked open from the cold. At night, the temperature dropped so low that the dead froze in the positions they'd fallen. And still, Bastogne held. The 101st Airborne, reinforced by fragments of other units, refused to surrender. Cut off from supply, they survived on meager rations, melting snow for water, patching wounds with bandages torn from clothing. When German envoys demanded surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe famously replied with a single word: nuts. That defiance, a mix of exhaustion, pride, and pure stubbornness, became the symbol of Bastogne. Outside the town, German soldiers waited for the weather to break. But it was they who were breaking. Entire companies went numb in the trenches, unable to fight or even hold their weapons. The same snow they had counted on to hide their advance now swallowed them whole. By Christmas Eve, the laughter was gone. The Ardennes had turned from battlefield to graveyard, a silent, frozen sea of trees and bodies. Somewhere in those woods, a German soldier rubbed his blackened fingers together, staring at the ice forming on his rifle, and whispered to no one, "The Americans were right." Because on that winter front, survival wasn't about bravery, it was about endurance. And the army that could endure the cold would soon win the war. By December 20th, 1944, Bastogne was completely surrounded. 7 major roads converged on the small Belgian town, and the Germans held every one of them. For the 101st Airborne Division inside, there was no escape. For the German 5th Panzer Army outside, there was one order: crush the pocket and open the road to the Meuse. The siege had begun. For both sides, it was not just a battle of bullets and artillery. It was a test against nature itself. Temperatures dropped below -20 degrees Celsius at night. Snow piled chest-deep in places. The air was so cold that the wounded froze before medics could reach them. Inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division and scattered remnants of shattered American units, dug in. They had few heavy weapons, limited ammunition, and almost no medical supplies. The men survived on a handful of rations per day, sometimes eating cold beans straight from cans, snow melting on their helmets for water. They wrapped scarves and bandages around their faces to protect against frostbite. Some wore tablecloths, curtains, or even curtains torn from bombed houses to keep warm. Helmets iced over. Rifles jammed from frozen oil. Yet somehow, morale held. The soldiers joked that they were the biggest targets in Europe. But they didn't break. Meanwhile, across the lines, the German offensive was beginning to choke itself to death. What had started as Hitler's gamble, a lightning strike through the Ardennes to split the Allied front, was now bogged down in snow and mud. The same fog and storms that had grounded Allied aircraft were also crippling the Wehrmacht's supply convoys. German armored units ran out of fuel faster than expected. Trucks and tanks froze in place overnight. Horses pulling supply wagons collapsed from exhaustion. Some soldiers had been marching in the same wet boots for days. When they stopped, frostbite set in within hours. Reports from German field hospitals described hundreds of frostbite cases, blackened toes, hands swollen beyond recognition, soldiers unable to hold rifles. Many amputations were performed in the field. The offensive that had promised quick victory was turning into a death march. Still, the Germans pressed on, their orders clear. Take Bastogne. It was the key crossroads blocking their advance. Without it, the attack could not reach the Meuse River or threaten Antwerp. So the shelling began. For days, German artillery hammered the town. Houses splintered into dust. Streets vanished under rubble. Every few minutes, shells screamed overhead and crashed into the snowbound town. The civilians who hadn't fled hid in cellars, huddled beside American medics who worked by candlelight in basements packed with wounded men. In those dark rooms, morphine ran out. Bandages froze. The smell of blood and cordite filled the air. Outside, the Americans fought from foxholes and frozen ditches. The line was thin, sometimes a single platoon holding a kilometer of front. They had no warm meals, no rest, no resupply. But they had something the Germans no longer did, a reason to hold. Because for them, Bastogne wasn't just another village, it was survival. If Bastogne fell, the entire southern flank of the Allied front would collapse, opening the road to Antwerp and prolonging the war for months. Every man knew it. And then came Christmas. Snow fell all night, covering the dead. The men of the 101st marked the day quietly, some whispering prayers, others too tired to speak. Chaplains held brief services between bombardments. Someone passed around a bottle of brandy. There were no presents, no food, no music, only cold, exhaustion, and the sound of shells. Across the frozen fields, the Germans were suffering even more. Their fuel was gone. Their tanks stalled. Rations had run out, and some units scavenged frozen American corpses for boots and gloves. Many soldiers no longer believed in victory. They fought only because retreat was suicide. In the snow and darkness of the Ardennes, discipline and morale dissolved together. Soldiers fired sporadically just to stay warm, burning what little fuel they had left in their vehicles for heat. By the last week of December, the laughter that had once echoed through German ranks was gone. The cold had claimed it, along with their hope. And as their lines began to falter, one name returned to the battlefield: Patton. His Third Army was coming north, racing through snow and ice to relieve Bastogne. But for the Germans outside the town, it was already too late. They were trapped in their own winter storm, frozen, starving, and surrounded by an enemy that refused to die. The same men who had laughed at American winter gear were now dying without gloves, their boots hard as stone, their rifles rusted with ice. The irony was total. In the frozen forests of Belgium, the arrogance of an empire was being buried, one snowflake at a time. By December 22, 1944, Bastogne was near collapse. The men of the 101st Airborne were freezing, starving, and almost out of ammunition. The Germans believed the Americans had reached their breaking point, and so they sent an offer. A delegation under a white flag approached the American lines, delivering a written message demanding surrender. The note was polite but firm. The American garrison was hopelessly surrounded, and any further resistance would lead to complete annihilation. The paper was carried to General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting commander of the 101st. He had just been woken from a brief sleep in a freezing cellar when he read it. The officers around him waited for his reply. McAuliffe looked up, half amused, half disgusted, and said one word: "Nuts!" The men laughed. The message was typed up and sent back to the German lines. When the German envoys asked what it meant, the American officer escorting them explained, "It means go to hell." That single word became the symbol of Bastogne's defiance. The German artillery responded immediately. Shells fell in waves. Buildings that had somehow remained standing collapsed into splinters. American medics struggled to keep up with the wounded. Snow mixed with blood on the streets. Yet morale held. In their foxholes, men of the 506th and 327th Glider Infantry clung to their rifles, waiting. They had no idea when relief would come, only that they would hold until it did. And far to the south, relief was coming. General George S. Patton, commanding the U.S. Third Army, had performed one of the most extraordinary maneuvers in modern warfare. Just days earlier, he had turned his entire army, more than 100,000 men, hundreds of tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces, 90 degrees north through snow-covered roads and frozen fields. His goal? Break the German ring around Bastogne. It was a logistical nightmare. Roads were clogged with ice and wreckage. Fuel froze in the lines. Bridges collapsed under the weight of tanks. But Patton's men moved anyway, pushing day and night, fighting both the enemy and the blizzard. By December 24th, the German offensive was stalling. The initial momentum was gone. The panzer divisions were out of fuel, their tanks immobilized in snowdrifts. Hitler's dream of splitting the Allied front and capturing Antwerp was dying in the cold. Inside Bastogne, Christmas Eve came with no miracles, only more shells. But that night, the skies finally began to clear. And with the morning sun came a sound the men hadn't heard in over a week: the roar of engines overhead. Allied transport planes, flying low through the fading clouds, began dropping supplies by parachute. Food, medicine, ammunition, and blankets floated down into the frozen town like salvation. For the first time in days, the men cheered. The airlift continued for 2 days, keeping the 101st alive. But the real breakthrough was still grinding toward them through snow and gunfire. Patton's 4th Armored Division was spearheading the relief. Every mile was contested by entrenched German troops, snipers, and anti-tank guns hidden in forests. They advanced yard by yard, losing tanks to mines and ambushes, pushing through small villages that existed only as smoking ruins. Many crews froze inside their own vehicles when engines stalled from the cold. Still, they moved forward, because the men trapped in Bastogne were counting on them. On December 26th, after days of brutal fighting, an American tank from the 37th Tank Battalion reached the southern edge of Bastogne. The lead Sherman rumbled through the snow-choked road, guns scanning for movement. Then, from a nearby foxhole, a group of paratroopers in filthy, frost-covered uniforms appeared, smiling, waving, shouting with relief. The siege was broken. Inside Bastogne, the men cheered until they had no voices left. Some wept. Others simply collapsed, too exhausted to react. For days, they had fought surrounded, outnumbered, and outgunned, and they had survived. The Germans tried to retake Bastogne in the following days, but the momentum was gone. Patton's Third Army widened the corridor, and soon the entire German salient began to crumble. What had begun as Hitler's last, desperate offensive was now turning into a full retreat. The Battle of the Bulge, his final gamble, was lost. For the German soldiers who had mocked American softness, who had sneered at their heavy coats and winter gear, the irony was brutal. They had frozen outside the very town they were supposed to capture. Their tanks were silent, their trucks buried in snow, their commanders furious but helpless. And for the men of Bastogne, those battered bastards of the 101st, they had not only survived one of the harshest winters in Europe's history, but had written a chapter of defiance that would define American courage forever. The cold hadn't broken them. It had made them legends. When the link to Patton's armor was finally secured, Bastogne was no longer a town. It was a graveyard encased in ice. The air smelled of smoke, diesel, and death. Nearly every building was shattered, streets were cratered, and bodies, both American and German, lay frozen in the positions where they'd fallen. The siege had lasted only a week, but it had felt like a lifetime to those inside. Out of roughly 11,000 defenders, nearly 2,500 were killed, wounded, or missing. The German losses were far worse. Thousands froze, starved, or were crushed under collapsing snowbanks and wrecked armor as they tried to withdraw through the blizzard. The men who had surrounded Bastogne were now in full retreat, hunted from the skies. As the weather cleared, Allied air superiority returned with vengeance. P-47 Thunderbolts strafed columns of German vehicles stuck on frozen roads, bombing convoys that stretched for miles. The white landscape turned black with smoke. The same snow that had once hidden their advance now marked their destruction. Those who escaped Bastogne's perimeter returned to their units changed men. The paratroopers of the 101st were gaunt, hollow-eyed, and frostbitten, their faces raw, their hands wrapped in rags. They had eaten powdered rations and melted snow for days, slept in frozen foxholes, and buried their dead under sheets of ice. Yet their spirits were unbroken. When journalists arrived and asked them about Patton's rescue, many of the men laughed. "We didn't need rescuing," one paratrooper said. "We were just fine." It wasn't arrogance, it was pride. Bastogne had been hell, but they had endured it. For the Germans, the humiliation ran deeper. Their winter offensive had promised a final victory, a last chance to split the Allies and force a peace. Instead, it had drained their reserves and crippled their army. The Battle of the Bulge became the Wehrmacht's last gasp on the Western Front, a desperate, costly gamble that left them too weak to stop the Allied push into Germany just months later. Many German soldiers never forgave their commanders. They had marched into the Ardennes wearing autumn coats and summer boots. They had been told the Americans were weak, that their equipment was inferior, that morale would crumble under pressure. But they had seen the opposite. The Americans didn't just fight, they endured. And that endurance was what broke the German offensive. In the frozen forests, patrols continued to clash long after the main battle was over. Medics searched the woods for the wounded, sometimes finding men still alive, half buried in snow, their breath shallow, their hands black with frostbite. Both sides left behind more than 100,000 casualties across the Ardennes. Men claimed not by bullets, but by the cold. As January 1945 began, the tide of the war was irreversible. The Allies surged forward, while the German army, shattered, frostbitten, and out of fuel, fell back toward its own borders. In the ruins of Bastogne, an American soldier stood watching a column of prisoners shuffle past, wrapped in torn blankets, their faces gray and expressionless. They had once laughed at his army's coats and boots. Now, their own uniforms were frozen stiff. He said nothing. He just watched them disappear into the snow. Because by then, the war had taught him something that no amount of training could. That survival wasn't just about strength or firepower. It was about preparation, endurance, and the will to stand when everything else fell apart. Bastogne had proven that. The men who held it didn't just fight for a crossroads. They fought for the belief that surrender was never an option, no matter the odds, no matter the cold. The frozen town became a monument not of strategy, but of resilience. In the months that followed, the men of Bastogne became legends. Newspapers called them the battered bastards of the 101st. What they had endured in that snow-covered fortress became a rallying cry for soldiers across Europe. The siege didn't just stop a German offensive, it defined a mindset. Bastogne proved that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the refusal to yield when fear consumed everything else. The 101st Airborne would fight again, pushing east as the Allies crossed the Rhine and advanced toward Germany. But for many of them, Bastogne would remain the defining moment of their lives. Veterans would later say that it wasn't just the Germans they fought, it was the hunger, the exhaustion, and the freezing cold that tried to break them. And it failed. General Eisenhower himself called Bastogne one of the most heroic stands in American military history. Patton, never one to praise lightly, called the 101st the finest soldiers that ever lived. For the Germans, the lesson was bitter. The same army that had conquered Europe through speed and surprise had underestimated the one thing they couldn't outfight: endurance. They had mocked American gear, ridiculed their supply obsession, and believed their will to fight would freeze in the snow. Instead, they froze outside Bastogne. The Battle of the Bulge marked the end of Germany's hopes on the Western Front. The failure to capture Bastogne broke their offensive momentum, drained their reserves, and sealed their fate. The Wehrmacht would never again mount a major attack. Today, the town of Bastogne still stands, rebuilt, scarred, and quiet. Monuments line the fields where paratroopers once dug into the frozen earth. Veterans return in the winter, standing in silence as snow falls over the same ground they once bled for. The sound of the wind carries the memory of their defiance. The same cold air, the same silence, the same courage that refused to die. Because Bastogne was never just a battle. It was a testament. A reminder that even when surrounded, outnumbered, and freezing, men who refuse to surrender can change the course of history. If this story moved you, if it made you feel the cold, the courage, and the unbreakable spirit of those who stood at Bastogne, don't just scroll away. Like this video, share it with a friend who loves true history, and subscribe to WW2 Heroes Legends, where the stories of real soldiers, real battles, and real courage will never be forgotten. Because their fight may be over, but their legacy will never fade.